The 1962 murder of 25-year-old Hajna de Kaplany by her husband of 5 weeks and the trial that followed laid bare something that's not talked about very much, which is that when it was first used in court, the gay panic defense was primarily deployed to defend or to explain heterosexual domestic murder, sexual assault, and on one occasion, the actions of a serial rapist who would go on to become the Golden State Killer. Thanks for joining me for Acid, the Murder of Hajna de Kaplany. On August 28, 1962, the city of Santa Clara, California, was experiencing a warmer than normal evening. Roommate school teachers in apartment number 9 of the 49-unit, 2-story ranch-style apartment building found the heat to be insufferable. To fight the heat wave, the roommates left the front door open. The usual peace of the apartment complex was disrupted by a blaring radio playing classical music upstairs. Around 7 p.m., the source of the loud music, their upstairs neighbor, Geza de Ka, without asking, walked into the schoolteacher's living room. Neither woman had ever met Dr. de Kaplan. The doctor said he hoped that they weren't bothered by the radio, then added that the loud radio would continue for a while. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back out into the courtyard, where he continued to pace back and forth. As promised, the loud radio continued, and later in the evening, the teachers heard moaning. They both said later that they couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman, but they both said that it was the sound of pain. The moaning became even louder, louder than the loud radio. It was so loud that nearly everyone in the complex came out to see what was going on. Everyone, that is, except for Dr. de Kaplan and his wife. The crowd began to gather at the pool, looking up at apartment 30, the home of Mr. and Mrs. de Kaplan. It was now nearly 10 o'clock when the police began to arrive. As the ambulance crew headed up to apartment 30, the sight they must have encountered must have shocked and disturbed them, but outside the moaning soon subsided. Inside the apartment, police and emergency workers found Hajna de Kaplany at the foot of the bed. She was naked and her hands and feet were tied. There was a pool of blood under her left breast. She was screaming. Several of the police and emergency workers had to leave the apartment because the air was thick with fumes. As attendants tried to remove Hajna's bindings, and as the police were trying to figure out what had taken place, Dr. de Kaplan sat in the kitchen/living room watching the frenzied scene as if it was an old movie he had seen many times before. Hajna de Kaplany implored the emergency workers to please untie my hands and feet and get me out of this house. In an effort to calm herself, she said, "I will stop crying now that you're here to help me." Hajna de Kaplany was transported to the hospital with third-degree burns over 60% of her body. At the hospital, Mrs. de Kaplan asked for and received last rites, saying she knew she was going to die. Then she told police what she recalled about the evening, saying, "He tied my hands behind my back with wire. He put a gag in my mouth. He turned up the radio. He opened a suitcase, took out 3 bottles of liquid, and sat them next to the butcher knife from the kitchen. Then he poured acid all over my body." She indicated her vaginal region. She ended by saying, "He was all ready for me." Thinking this was a dying declaration, the police asked Mrs. de Kaplan, "Who did these things to you?" "My husband," she replied. Dr. de Kaplan now changed out of his red Bermuda shorts into a smartly tailored suit and tie, and was escorted out of the apartment complex and into police custody. Geza de Ka readily confessed to the acid attack, so you think that his confession, combined with his wife's detailed description of her horrific ordeal, would make his conviction an open and shut matter, but nothing could be further from the truth. The trial would prove to be a grand guignol of tales of torture, pleas of insanity, and an accusation of hidden homosexual desire and schizophrenic madness. Geza de Kaplan in many ways was an extraordinary person. Born in Hungary in 1926, de Kaplan graduated with honors in 1951, going on to practice cardiology in Budapest. In 1956, when the Hungarian uprising, a countrywide resistance against the government, began, de Kaplan joined the resistance. When it became clear the efforts of the resistance would fail, he and what was left of his family fled the country. He wrote a book called Doctor in Revolt about his experience, and some say inflated experiences of being a freedom fighter against the resistance. He and his family were taken in as political refugees in the late 50s. De Kaplan's medical qualifications wouldn't apply in the United States, so he trained at both Harvard and Yale, working as an anesthesiologist at hospitals in California. The thing one reads most often about Hajna Pila was that she was a very beautiful woman, with all that carries with it, particularly in 1962. She was a performer who worked as a showgirl in the tradition of the women in the Folies Bergères, wearing large headdresses with small costumes. Pictures of her in these costumes drove the press into a frenzy, but most reporters eventually found out that there was much more to Ms. Pilar than her looks. Hajna Pilar was also from Hungary. Her father was a famous Olympic athlete and trainer who, like the de Kaplan family, claimed political asylum in the United States due to the Hungarian Revolution. Hajna and her mother fled Hungary in 1956 on foot to Austria, then to West Germany, finally joining her father in San Francisco. 3 years after their escape, Hajna's father died, leaving she and her mother alone in a new country with few means of financial support, leaving Hajna to do what she could to support herself and her mother. At trial, a great deal would be made of Geza de Kaplan's motives for his treatment, his violent treatment of his wife. But it's important to know that he was, as I said, an extraordinary person in terms of his accomplishments. But he was also a priggish man who thought a great deal of himself and a great deal less of women. He came from a very prosperous, wealthy Hungarian family with royal origins, but all of that hid the fact of violence. Geza's father was a violent man who once beat Geza de Kaplany so violently that the child lost sight in one of his eyes. Escaping Hungary and the death of his 3 brothers, 2 having died as officers in World War I, the other at the age of 15 in the conflicts in Hungary, meant that Geza de Kaplany and his mother were quite close. At trial, that closeness would be the source of speculation, as their relationship was used to explain the source of de Kaplan's repressed homosexuality and the homosexual panic he felt in the murder of his wife. On August 29, 1962, Geza de Kapalny was charged with the attempted murder of his wife. Under arrest, de Kapalny admitted he had committed the assault because he believed his wife had been unfaithful to him. He wanted to make her unattractive to any other men and to keep her from being an adulteress. This quote from the San Francisco Chronicle, August 31st, 1962, pretty much sums up the doctor's temperament in custody. Police said the physician slept well and ate heartily and exhibited a complete disinterest in his bride's condition. As I said initially, Dr. de Kapalny was charged with attempted murder, but after 33 days, hovering between life and death, Hajna de Kapalny died on September 30th, 1962. And with her death, her husband's charges were upgraded to murder. Despite his confession, by the time he went to trial, the doctor was claiming he was not guilty due to mental illness. After interviewing nearly 200 prospective jurors, on January 11, 1963, 10 men and 2 women were chosen. For their part, the prosecution told the jury that Dr. de Kapalny was not insane and that his commission of the torture murder of his wife was coolly planned and executed. The state sought to counter the idea of de Kapalny being a repressed homosexual by having a parade of women testify to their sexual relationships with the doctor. The state asked female witness after female witness if the doctor was normal in the bedroom and if they'd noticed any homosexual leanings in the doctor. Each woman replied they did not and that they thought he was normal. As ridiculous as it seems that a man's sexual prowess with women would be used in court as proof that he's not gay, it's not completely foreign as a rationale. I mean, we still hear it today. The difference is, today that same behavior might be better understood to be proof of one's insecurities. The prosecution then moved on to focus on de Kaplany's premeditation, outlining the steps he took to torture his wife. De Kaplany's police interviews were played. In one section, he said he hadn't wanted to kill his wife and was sure the acid wouldn't kill her, even though some of the acid he used had burned a hole into the floor of the bedroom. He minimized his actions by saying, after a few drops, he stopped and he called for help. This, of course, wasn't supported by the number of injuries his wife had sustained, nor did it account for the cut on her left breast. Asked how he became aware that his wife was having an affair, de Kaplany said an elderly friend told him his wife was cheating. So, like a poisonous ill wind, a rumor had set Dr. de Kaplany on a course of revenge. Hajna de Kaplany did have a former boyfriend who was an engineer, but they had broken it off before the marriage. He testified at the trial that the rumors were so pernicious that he had to leave his job and that he and his wife had to leave the United States. The prosecution introduced police officers and investigators who had been assigned to the case. In one interesting exchange, the defense asked the detective, "Do you think homosexuality is normal or rational?" The detective answered, "No." The defense asked, "Did you have any sense that the doctor was homosexual?" The detective responded, "No." The defense asked him again, "Do you remember going through the doctor's things at the apartment and coming across letters from a man in Boston?" The detective answered, "Yes." The defense asked, "Do you remember laughing at the content saying that Dr. de Kaplany was a homosexual?" The detective said, "I laughed as much as you did, but yes, I do remember saying that." Asked what he thought now about Dr. de Kaplany's sexuality, the detective said, "I think the doctor is bisexual." In their opening remarks, de Kaplany's defense told the court their client was mentally triggered by his wife's coldness and lack of intimacy, exacerbated by rumors of infidelity, provoking the doctor into a homosexual panic, meaning the torture of his wife was an act of insanity for which he was not guilty. To understand the use of homosexuality as a mental defect defense, you have to remember or keep in mind that homosexuality was considered a mental illness until the 1970s. The other detail is that homosexual panic, or gay and trans panic as we know it now, is not a legal defense. It's more of a rationale, an explanation for the act of murder. As it was used in this case in most of the 1960s, first you had to establish that your client was mentally ill, and having established that, then you could assert homosexual panic in the course of a psychological episode triggered by one's own internalized homophobia. The first psychiatrist for the state testified that Dr. de Kaplany killed his wife in a rage, perhaps even a delusional rage, but he was not insane at the time of the crime. The second psychiatrist, Dr. Johnson, examined de Kaplany 3 times and told the court that the doctor disliked nearly everything about his wife, but was compelled by her beauty. De Kaplany told Dr. Johnson that he nearly called off the wedding because he so despised the idea that she was a showgirl. With resignation, finally, he told her, "Well, I didn't think you'd be a virgin," and with that, the marriage was back on. Sounds like a terrific start to a life together, doesn't it? Dr. Johnson told the court that de Kaplany complained that his wife refused to have any sexual relations with him of any kind, that she wouldn't even allow him to kiss her. Dr. Johnson said this, combined with the idea of her infidelity, began to drive Dr. de Kaplany to distraction. De Kaplany told Dr. Johnson he confronted Hajna, asking her why she preferred her lover's company to his. He says she replied that the other man could satisfy her and her husband couldn't. De Kaplany said he slapped Hajna, then threw her on the bed, tying her hands to the bedposts. He said he did this so she wouldn't run away. He threatened her with the butcher knife from the kitchen. He told the doctor that from this point on, he couldn't remember what happened. De Kaplany said he thought he remembered pouring acid on her face, but he wasn't sure. He said he couldn't remember pouring it on her body. The doctor said the next thing he remembered is that his wife was on the floor and there was blood around her breast, and the room was full of fumes. He said all he could think of was to call for help, which he did. Dr. Johnson concluded from the stand that Geza de Kapalny was alert, responsive, emotionally controlled, and somewhat tense. He concluded by saying Dr. de Kapalny was sane during and after the murder. The insanity defense offered by de Kapalny's lawyers was divided into three parts, and homosexual panic ran through at least two of them. First, they had to establish his mental illness or defect, which they said was schizophrenia. Then there was the hyperattachment to his mother. And the third was a multiple personality, who they say actually committed the crime, but we'll get to that in a minute. To establish mental illness, Dr. Zaslow from San Jose State Psychiatric Hospital took the stand. He testified that he had given de Kapalny several tests, including the Rorschach's test, concluding that Geza de Kapalny was a paranoid schizophrenic. Schizophrenia was part of the homosexual panic diagnosis from its inception in the 1920s. In part, it's because schizophrenia was misunderstood by the psychiatric community, and so was homosexuality, which is not and was not a mental illness, but was associated with a disordered mind. De Kapalny told Dr. Zaslow that he thought women were superficial and men virtuous, moral, adding that he didn't think women could be trusted, all except his mother. It strikes me that Dr. de Kapalny's views of men and women might have been influenced by his Hungarian background, but it was also a view that many men and not a few women subscribed to through most of the 20th century. The defense and the prosecution would seek to use de Kapalny's views of women to both acquit and convict him. The defense tried to get the state psychiatrists to confirm that there was something off-balanced about Dr. de Kapalny. Primarily, they tried and failed to get the witnesses to say that they had identified homosexual tendencies in de Kapalny. Neither psychiatrist found the doctor to be suffering from schizophrenia either, or any other mental illness. On January 30th, the 15th day of the trial, Dr. A. Russell Lee took the stand to add the third tentpole to de Kapalny's defense. He testified to his 8 hours of interviews with Dr. de Kapalny, and his conclusion was that the doctor suffered from multiple personality disorder and acute schizophrenia. De Kapalny's alter ego, Pierre LaRouche, was a product of that multiple personality. De Kapalny told Dr. Lee that it was LaRouche who was responsible for the assault on his wife, and not himself. As Dr. Lee was presenting this part of his testimony, one of the deputies at the back of the courtroom could be heard grumbling, "I gotta get out of here. He's making me sick." Dr. Lee told the jury that de Kapalny felt he had abandoned his mother, who was ill and unable to leave Hungary, and that the rapidly failing marriage just increased whatever pressure and guilt that the doctor felt. At one stage, in their interview, Dr. Lee asked de Kapalny about a photograph of him dressed as a girl. Even though the photograph was taken at school many years before, the doctor had gone to an all-boys school. The questioning then landed on whether de Kapalny ever thought about becoming a woman. De Kapalny said that he had thought about it when he was younger because he was smaller than his brothers and the other boys. Dr. de Kapalny and his hours of recordings were the last witnesses for the defense. In its summation, the state mentioned the defense's claim that Dr. de Kapalny didn't mean to kill his wife. The prosecuting attorney grabbed one of the photos of Mrs. de Kapalny, shouting to the jury, "This is all he intended if she lived?" Banging the desk with the photo in hand, "This is all he intended? And what a horrible intent that someone would have to live like this. My God, isn't this more inhumane than killing?" The defense began its closing argument by acknowledging that the doctor's actions were horrible and atrocious, an act, he went on, that revolts us all. Through tears, Dr. de Kapalny's attorney said, "Everyone's heart goes out to her." Then he turned quickly to his client's view of his wife and her mother by saying, Dr. de Kapalny found Hajna somewhat shallow. He went on to assert that Hajna de Kapalny's mother wanted her to marry a wealthy man, and so Dr. de Kapalny was chosen, leaving the clear impression that wealth and status were the only things that Hajna de Kapalny was interested in when it came to Geza de Kapalny. The attorney buttoned up this part of his presentation by apportioning the last part of blame onto the gossipy friend who had sparked the idea of an unfaithful wife. Having used his client's relationship with his mother to prove his insanity or instability, he then tried to provoke sympathy from the jury by reminding them that Dr. de Kaplan's mother was too sick to leave Hungary, that she was living with dread and heartache, knowing that her son was facing a trial all alone. The defense ended by imploring the jury to consider how Dr. de Kaplan's life with his cold, withholding wife and the guilt he felt for having abandoned his mother for a terrible marriage had caused him stress, driving this man to a schizophrenic break. I'm asking you to find him criminally insane and not guilty by reason of insanity. The case was now in the hands of the jury. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the first part of the verdict, which was determining whether Dr. de Kapalny was responsible for the murder or was he insane at the time he committed this act. On February 21st, 1963, at 11:30 a.m., the jury found that Dr. Geza de Kapalny was sane at the time of the murder. They were dismissed for the weekend. On the following Monday, the jury was then charged with deciding the level of Dr. de Kapalny's guilt and his punishment. After another 15 hours of deliberation, in part because they had to review the hours of psychological examination tapes, the jury found Geza de Kapalny should be imprisoned for life. His attorneys were thrilled that he had been spared the death penalty. De Kapalny remained emotionless throughout. The insanity multiple personality defense might not have held much sway with the jury, but the fact of Dr. de Kapalny's class and profession seems to have worked on the judge, who sentenced Geza de Kapalny to life in a mental hospital for the criminally insane. Though de Kapalny was sentenced to life in a mental institution, he was released quietly on November 13, 1976, and whisked out of the country to Taiwan and a teaching position. His release and transport were aided in no small part by the Catholic Church, including San Francisco's Archbishop. After meeting Dr. de Kapalny in prison, Father Schmitz of the San Francisco Bay Area summed up his reasons for de Kapalny's release. He wrote, "His medical studies in Hungary and the United States, his 2 medical degrees and PhD, his opposition to communism and shedding his blood in the 1956 revolution in Hungary all showed a character and ability that could not be wiped out by a single action, even that of murder." All these rationales aside, it was fairly common for men who killed their wives in the 1960s to only serve about 14 years in prison. So de Kapalny's 13-year sentence seems right in line with prison sentences in that time period. After he left the country, there was very little news of Dr. de Kapalny in South Asia. He lost the Taiwanese teaching position once they found out the nature of his crime. In 2002, a California newspaper tracked Geza de Kapalny to Germany, where he had been living. I wanted to cover this case in part because the use of the homosexual panic defense in heterosexual domestic life shows how the taint of homosexuality looms so large that it could give one license to kill. By the end of the 1960s, as the gay liberation movement rose in prominence, the homosexual panic defense began to be used in court, primarily as a defense for heterosexual men killing gay men, and then as a defense in the murders of trans men and women. It's not too surprising that the use of the homosexual panic defense is hardly ever mentioned in the case of Geza de Kapalny, or in the cases of heterosexual domestic battery and murder in general. In part, in this case, the murder is so gruesome that the details draw all the attention. But it's also true that until recently, queer history has been muted or disappeared completely. I think in order to understand where we've been, not to mention attitudes and prohibitions that linger today, we have to know where they came from, and this case provides us with a clear window into a not too distant past. The 25 years that Hajna de Kapalny lived were too few, and the manner of her death too brutal, To have it treated as if it were a minor detail in a dog and pony show, as if she were just some airhead, money-grubbing beauty whose long-suffering husband went too far. To get to this terrible end, she had to escape war on foot, which takes some grit. She loved her mother and tried to do what she could to look after her. I guess simply put, she was a human being who deserved in life and death to be loved and remembered with respect. If you'd like to read more about the trial, and boy, is there more, the book, The Trial of Dr. de Kaplany, is a really good read. It's by Carolyn Ansbacher. She sat through the trial. It was published in 1965. Please subscribe to the channel or to the podcast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.